Vivienne Holt found out she was worth exactly $412 on a Tuesday morning in November, which was the same morning the bank called to say the line of credit her late husband had co-signed was being recalled in full. She was standing in the kitchen of the house in Oakville when she took the call. The coffee was still brewing. Outside the window, the maple in the backyard had dropped its last leaves overnight, and they sat on the frozen ground in a layer of rust and brown, the way things settle when they have finally given up holding on. She listened to the man on the phone say words she understood individually, but had trouble assembling into a sentence that applied to her life. Recalled. 30 days. Outstanding balance, she said. I understand the way people say things when they do not yet understand them at all. Vivienne Holt was 51 years old. She had been a bookkeeper for 23 years at a small architectural firm in Burlington. She kept the accounts of other people's money with a precision that her employer had once called surgical. She knew how to read a balance sheet. She knew how to find the number that mattered buried inside a column of numbers that did not. She had simply never had to read one with her own name at the top. Her husband, Martin, had handled everything else, not because she could not, because the division had happened gradually, the way divisions happen in long marriages, quietly, without announcement, until one morning you realize you do not know the password to the account that pays the mortgage, and the man who did know it died 8 months ago in a hospital room in Hamilton, with a ventilator doing the breathing for him and the debt still compounding. Martin had been a contractor, a good one. He had built decks and additions and one very beautiful screened porch on a property in Ancaster that a magazine had photographed for its spring issue. He had also, over the last 4 years of his life, borrowed against the business in ways Vivienne had not fully seen because she had trusted the general shape of their life, even when she should have been looking at the specific numbers inside it. The business died with him, the debt did not. The coffee finished brewing. She poured a cup. She stood at the window and looked at the maple and the leaves on frozen ground, and the sky above it that was the color of old pewter, the particular gray of a Canadian November that does not promise anything. She drank the coffee standing up. She thought about her mother, who had raised her alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Winnipeg, on a government worker's salary, and a ferocity that Vivienne had once mistaken for hardness, and had later understood, was simply the face that love makes when it cannot afford to be soft. She set the cup down. She went to the desk in the small room off the hallway where Martin had kept his files. She opened the drawers. She spent 3 hours reading everything inside them. By noon, she had a number, not 412. That was the checking account. The real number, the one that described her actual position in the world, was larger, and it was negative, and it had several zeros after it. She had 2 daughters. Nora was 26. She lived in Vancouver and worked in marketing, and called on Sundays, and meant well in the distracted way of people who are living their own lives at full speed, and have not yet had occasion to slow down. Claire was 30. She lived 40 minutes away in Mississauga with her husband Patrick, and a daughter of her own who was 4 years old and had recently started calling Vivienne Grand V, in a voice that still hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Claire checked in more often. Claire brought groceries sometimes. Claire said, "Mom, you need to tell me what's actually going on." And Vivienne said, "I'm fine," because she had been saying "I'm fine" for 8 months, and the words had worn a groove in her that was easier to follow than to step out of. After she read the files, Vivienne called neither of her daughters. She sat at the desk with the papers in front of her and the number written on a notepad in her own handwriting. Her handwriting, her number. She looked at it for a long time. Then she put the notepad in the top drawer and closed it and went back to the kitchen and made a second cup of coffee and began to figure out what came next. What came next was the house. The house in Oakville had 4 bedrooms and a finished basement and a yard with the maple and a covered porch. Martin had built the summer Nora was born. The summer he still had strong hands and no debt, and the particular confidence of a man in his 30s who believes the future is something he is building, rather than something that is arriving whether he is ready or not. The house was mortgaged. Not terminally, but the payments were Martin's payments, calibrated to Martin's income, and Martin's income was gone, and the recall on the line of credit had made the math unworkable in a way that did not have a polite solution. She could sell it. A house in Oakville in that condition would sell quickly. The market was what it was. She would clear enough to pay the debts and have something left. Not a lot, but something. She would need to find somewhere smaller. Somewhere she could afford a loan on a bookkeeper's salary, which was a sentence she had not had to construct since she was 27 years old. The firm she worked for had offered her reduced hours after Martin died. A kindness, she had taken it. She now worked 3 days a week and spent the other 2 in a state she did not have a clean word for, something between grief and paralysis and the specific fog that descends when the structure of your daily life disappears and you have not yet built another one. She called the firm on Wednesday morning and asked to go back to full-time. Her employer, a woman named Sandra Park, who wore her hair short and her glasses on a chain, and said what she meant without preamble, said of course and when, and Vivienne said Monday, and Sandra said Monday it is. She listed the house on a Thursday. It sold in 11 days. By the time the sale closed in February, Vivienne had found an apartment in Hamilton. Second floor of a duplex on a street with old elms that would be green again in 4 months, though they did not look it now. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that faced east, and a heating system that made a sound like someone clearing their throat every time it cycled on. The rent was $1,200 a month. She could manage $1,200 a month. She moved her furniture in on a Saturday with the help of Claire and Patrick, and Claire's older brother-in-law, who had a truck and said almost nothing the entire day, but carried the heaviest boxes without being asked. The girls did not know the full extent of it. She had told them enough. The house needed to be sold. Things were tight. She was fine. She was always fine. Claire had offered money. Vivienne had declined with the specific firmness of a woman who had spent a lifetime sure her children did not need to worry about her and was not prepared to stop now. Nora had cried briefly on the phone and then offered to fly home for the move, and Vivienne had said, "Sweetheart, I'm all right." And Nora had believed her because children, even grown ones, believe their parents when they say, "I'm all right," because the alternative requires a reckoning that no one wants to begin. The apartment had almost no furniture she recognized as hers. Most of what she had kept was practical. A bed, a table, 4 chairs. A bookshelf she had owned since her 20s. A thing of pale pine that had moved with her from Winnipeg to Toronto to Burlington to Oakville and now to Hamilton, getting more battered with each move, the shelves sagging slightly in the middle from decades of books. The paint on one corner chipped from a door frame in the Burlington apartment where she and Martin had lived before the girls were born, before the house, before all of it. She kept it because it was hers in a way that predated everything that had happened to her and everything that had been taken away. The first Monday at full-time felt like putting on a coat she had almost forgotten she owned. The work itself had not changed. Numbers behaved the same way they always had. She sat at her desk and reconciled accounts and found the discrepancies and fixed them, and produced reports that were clean and precise, and she was good at this. She had always been good at this, and the goodness of it steadied her in a way that nothing else had in 8 months. You cannot grieve in a spreadsheet. The numbers are either right or they are not, and when they are right, the column resolves and the account closes, and there is a small complete satisfaction in that which has nothing to do with feeling and everything to do with competence. She walked to work on the days when the weather allowed it, 40 minutes from the duplex to the office. She had not walked to work since she was in her 20s. She wore the right shoes now. She had learned her lesson about wrong shoes on a day in March, when the sidewalk was still icy in patches and she had slipped twice and arrived at work with wet socks and the particular indignity of a person who misjudged the season. She bought good boots. She wore them every day until May. It was on one of these walks in the third week of March that she passed the building on James Street North. It was a brick building, narrow, sandwiched between a printing shop and a Vietnamese restaurant. The ground floor had been empty for a while. She had walked past it twice before without stopping. The third time she stopped. In the window, a paper sign printed in plain black text, Community Bookkeeping Clinic. Thursdays, 6 to 8 p.m. Help with taxes, benefits applications, financial basics. All welcome, no cost. Below it, in smaller letters, a handwritten addition in blue pen, volunteers needed. No numbers? Come in. She stood at the window for a moment. She looked at the sign. She thought about the notepad in the desk drawer in Oakville, the one with her number on it, the -1 with the zeros. She thought about the 3 hours she had spent reading Martin's files and the specific helplessness of understanding what you are reading and not having known you needed to read it sooner. She wrote the address in her phone. She went on a Thursday in April. The inside of the building was one large room with folding tables arranged in a loose horseshoe and fluorescent lights, and a coffee maker on a card table in the corner that was working harder than the rest of the room. There were 8 people sitting at the tables when Vivienne arrived. Some were clients, some were volunteers. The distinction was not always visible. A woman at the far table had her tax slips spread in front of her, and the expression of a person who has been avoiding something for 3 months. A man near the window was talking quietly to a volunteer, both of them leaning over a form, the volunteer pointing to a line with a pencil. The person running the clinic was named Adele Tremblay. She was maybe 65, with the compact, efficient manner of a retired administrator, and the kind of patience that does not look like patience because it has no performance in it. She stood up when Vivienne came in and said, "Can I help you?" And Vivienne said, "I saw the sign about volunteers." And Adele looked at her for a moment the way people look when they are quickly assessing whether someone means what they say, then said, "What do you know?" And Vivienne said, "Bookkeeping, 23 years." Adele said, "Sit down." That was April. By June, Vivienne was there every Thursday. By September, she was there Tuesdays as well, because the clinic had expanded and Adele's knee had begun giving her trouble, and she did not say so, but Vivienne noticed. The people who came to the clinic were various. Seniors who had never filed electronically. New Canadians navigating a tax system built in a language that was sometimes their second and sometimes their third. Single parents. People who had lost work and were trying to understand what they were entitled to. People who owed money they did not know they owed. People who were owed money they did not know to claim. A man came in one Tuesday in October. He was in his 70s, carefully dressed, a canvas jacket with a flannel shirt underneath the kind of clothing worn by a person who takes care of what they have. He sat down across from Vivienne and placed a folder on the table. Inside were 3 years of unfiled returns and a letter from the CRA with language that had frightened him into doing nothing, which was the worst possible response, but also the most human one. His name was Henri Fournier. He had been a machinist in Hamilton for 38 years. He had retired at 65 and lost his wife to Parkinson's 4 years later. The medical costs had not bankrupted him, but they had stripped him close to the surface. He had been managing alone since then, which meant managing the way people manage when they are competent at practical things, and afraid of bureaucratic ones, one problem at a time, avoiding the drawer where the CRA letters lived. Vivienne did not tell him not to worry. She did not say it was fine. She opened the folder and read what was in it. She asked him questions in the straightforward way of someone who has no interest in making a person feel worse than they already do. He answered them. She made notes. She found in the second unfiled year a spousal caregiver credit he had not claimed. She found in the third year a medical expense claim that had been missed entirely. The refund, once the returns were filed and processed, would be just over $2,000. She told him this matter-of-factly, the way you report facts. Henri Fournier sat across the folding table from her and looked at the number she had written on the notepad and said, "I did not know that was there," she said. "A lot of people don't." He said, "My wife always did the taxes." She said, "I know." She knew because she had been the wife who did the taxes for someone else and had not looked at the drawer where the other papers lived. He came back the following month with two things: a box of butter tarts from a bakery on Barton Street, which he set in the middle of the table without ceremony, and a question. He said, "My neighbor, Margaret, she is 82 and she cannot come here herself. Could someone go to her?" Vivienne said, "I can go." He said, "I did not want to assume." She said, "I'll go Thursday morning." Margaret Ellison lived in a low-rise apartment building on the East Mountain. She had a walker with a basket attached to it, and a cat named something Vivienne did not catch, and 3 years of unfilled returns, because the forms had become impossible for her to read clearly, and she had been too proud to say so to anyone who could have helped. She and Vivienne sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Margaret made tea twice. The cat sat on top of a pile of newspapers and monitored the proceedings. By the end of the second tea, the returns were complete, and Margaret was owed a refund she had not known about, and Vivienne had been shown 3 photographs of Margaret's grandchildren in Kamloops, 2 of whom looked exactly like their grandmother around the eyes. Vivienne told no one about these visits except Adele, who said, "Good," and then said nothing more because Adele operated on the principle that the correct response to a person doing useful work was to get out of their way. She did not tell her daughters, not because she was hiding something, because the things that mattered most had always been the things she could not explain quickly. The 40-minute walks in all weather, the Thursday evenings under fluorescent lights, the Tuesday afternoons, the specific feeling of sitting across from a person who was afraid of an envelope and staying with them until the envelope was open. These things did not translate into the summary she could offer in a Sunday phone call. They were things she was doing because they needed doing, and because she needed to do them, and because the doing of them was the only way she knew to remember that she was still capable of being useful, which was not a small thing when the rest of your life has rearranged itself around a loss you are still learning to carry. In December, Adele called her. Not at the clinic. At home. She said there was something she wanted to talk about, and she asked if Vivienne could come by the following Saturday. The building on James Street North looked different on a Saturday morning. Quieter. The folding tables were stacked against the wall. The coffee maker was off. Adele had brought a thermos and 2 cups, and they sat in the chairs by the window with the pale winter light coming through the glass. Adele said, "I am retiring at the end of March." She said it the way she said everything, directly, without preamble. She said the clinic needs someone to run it, not volunteer. Salaried, though not much. She said, "I have been watching how you work." She said, "I would like that person to be you." Vivienne looked at the thermos. She looked at the folding tables stacked against the wall. She thought about the apartment on the street with the elms. $1,200 a month, east-facing kitchen, the heating system clearing its throat in the night. She thought about Martin's files, the drawer, the number with the zeros. She thought about a woman in Winnipeg raising 2 girls alone on a salary that required precision and discipline, and a refusal to be soft when softness was a luxury. She looked at Adele and said, "Can I have a week?" Adele said, "You can have the weekend. That's who I am." Vivienne said, "I'll call you Sunday." She walked home in the cold 40 minutes, the streets half empty on a Saturday morning, the elms bare along her block, the sky doing its pewter thing, the same gray it had been when she stood at the kitchen window in Oakville 13 months ago, and listened to a man on the phone explain what her life now looked like. She walked the same way she had been walking since March, with the good boots and the deliberate pace of a person who has places to be, and has decided to take them seriously. She called Adele on Sunday and said yes. The handover took 3 months. Adele trained her in the administrative parts, the grant applications, the reporting, the relationship with the CRO liaison, who was a young man named Darren, and who was more helpful than his institutional email style suggested. Adele introduced her to the other volunteers one by one, each one a person with a specific thing to offer: a retired accountant, a former benefits worker, a young woman doing her CPA who came on Thursday evenings because her own grandmother had once needed help like this and no one had come. Adele showed her the filing system and the client intake forms and the folder on the shared drive labeled, in Adele's characteristic style, "Important. Do not move." On Adele's last day, there was no ceremony. That was Adele's preference. She came in at 6, helped with the evening clients, filed the last forms in the system, washed her coffee cup, and put her coat on. She looked at Vivienne. She said, "You know what to do." Vivienne said, "I learned from you." Adele said, "No. You knew most of it already. You just needed a place to do it." She walked out. The door closed. The room kept going the way rooms keep going when the work inside them does not depend on any one person to believe in it. By the following autumn, the clinic had moved to a larger space 2 blocks south. Not because Vivienne had expanded it in any dramatic or deliberate way, but because the word had spread the way things spread in communities where services are scarce, quietly and rapidly, and through personal recommendation. Henri brought 3 people from his building. Margaret told a woman in her exercise class. A woman named Patrice, who ran a newcomer support group out of a church on Aberdeen, started referring her clients on Tuesday afternoons. The room was fuller. The folding tables were fuller. The coffee maker was working harder. Vivienne hired a part-time coordinator, a woman named Sue Yan, who had a background in social services and an organizational discipline that made Vivienne feel calm in the way that competent colleagues always do. They worked well together the way 2 people work well when neither of them is trying to run the room. Henri came in on a Tuesday in October. He was not there as a client. He had been filing his own returns since the previous spring, on time, with care, the spousal credit claimed correctly and without assistance. He came in because, he said, he had been telling people about the clinic, and someone had asked him whether they needed more help, and he had said he did not know but he would ask. Vivienne said, "What are you offering?" He said, "I am not an accountant. I am a machinist. I know nothing about numbers." She said, "Do you know how to sit with someone who is scared of a letter?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I know how that letter feels." She said, "Then you know enough." He said, "All right." She pointed to a chair at the intake table. He sat down. She handed him a form and said, "I'll show you." He learned the intake process over 3 weeks. He was not fast. He was careful. He asked questions when he did not understand something, which Vivienne had learned to treat as a mark of seriousness rather than a limitation. Because the people who do not ask questions are the ones who proceed on assumption, and assumption in a tax clinic is a form of error waiting to happen. By November, Henri Fournier was sitting at the intake table every Tuesday afternoon, asking the same questions Vivienne had once asked him, checking the same boxes, listening in the same way, with the patience of a man who had been frightened by an envelope and had not forgotten what that felt like. On a Tuesday evening in late November, after the last client had gone, and Sue Yan had locked the back door, and Henri had folded his chair and put on his canvas jacket, Vivienne stood alone for a few minutes in the empty room, The fluorescent lights hummed. The coffee maker was off. The folding tables sat in their configuration, the chairs pushed in, the intake forms in their folder on the table by the door. Everything where it was supposed to be. The room in its quiet version, which was different from its empty version, in the way that a place where work happens carries a different quality of silence than a place where nothing does. She turned off the lights. She put on her coat. She walked home in the November dark. 40 minutes, the elms bare again, the leaves long gone, the sky, the color of pewter, the good boots on the frozen pavement, steady and sure. The same street, the same walk. A different version of the same woman who had stood 13 months ago in a kitchen in Oakville, with a coffee cup and a phone call and a number on a notepad that described her life as a deficit. She had not erased the number. She had not pretended it wasn't real. She had read it, put it in a drawer, made a second cup of coffee, and started figuring out what came next. This is what came next. Claire called on Sunday as she always did. Her daughter, the 4-year-old, got on the phone at some point and said, "Gran V, I made a picture of you," and Vivienne said, "What does it look like?" And the girl said, "It's you, but you're really big," and Vivienne said, "Am I?" and the girl said, "You're the biggest one in the whole picture," and Vivienne sat with that for a moment and said, "I love you," and the girl said, "I know," and handed the phone back to her mother. Nora called after. She was applying for a new job. She was nervous about it. She said, "Mom, can I tell you about it?" And Vivienne said, "Of course," and listened for 20 minutes the way she always listened, without interruption, without advice until it was asked for. The way her own mother had listened to her from a 2-bedroom apartment in Winnipeg, across whatever distance the years had put between them. When Nora was finished, she said, "Mom, how are you really?" And Vivienne said, "I'm good. Not fine. Good. It's different." Nora was quiet for a second. She said, "Different how?" And Vivienne thought about Henri at the intake table. She thought about Margaret's cat on the newspapers, and the tea made twice, and the refund Margaret had not known to claim. She thought about Adele's thermos on a Saturday morning, and the words, "You know most of it already, you just needed a place to do it." She said, "I have somewhere to be. I didn't used to." Nora said, "I'm glad, Mom," and meant it, the way children mean it, when they understand that something has changed in their parent, and the change is not a loss, but a different kind of arrival. There are, according to Statistics Canada, more than 2 million Canadians over 65 who live alone. Of those, a significant portion are women who spent their working lives managing households, raising children, supporting partners, keeping other people's lives running with precision and care and very little acknowledgement. When those lives change, as lives change, the skills do not disappear. They are simply waiting for a room to work in. Vivienne Holt found her room at the end of a walk on a street with elms. The work was not glamorous. The pay was not enough. The fluorescent lights were too bright, and the coffee maker was working hard. And the folding tables were cold if you put your arms on them on a winter night. She went in every Tuesday and every Thursday. She sat across from people who were afraid of envelopes, and she opened them. That was the whole of it. That was everything. I think about Vivienne standing at that kitchen window in Oakville a lot. Not the dramatic version of the moment. Just the quiet one. Coffee brewing. Maple leaves on frozen ground. A phone call she did not expect, making the numbers real in a way she had been avoiding for 8 months. What strikes me is not the loss. Loss comes for everyone in one form or another. What strikes me is what she did after she hung up. She made a second cup of coffee. She sat down. She started reading. That is not a small thing. Most of us, when we find out we are worse off than we thought, do one of two things. We panic and make fast decisions that feel like action but are really just noise. Or we go quiet in a way that is not rest but avoidance. The kind of stillness where the drawer with the letters stays closed because opening it feels like making it more real. Vivienne did neither. She read every page. She wrote down the number. She put it in the drawer and began figuring out what came next. That is what I would call real intelligence. Not the kind that scores well on tests, but the kind that can sit with a hard truth and still think clearly. It is rarer than people admit. It requires a particular kind of honesty with yourself, the willingness to look at the actual situation rather than the one you wished you were in. But knowing what is true is only part of it. Henri Fournier knew his returns were unfilled. Margaret Ellison knew she needed help with her forms. They knew. The knowing was not the problem. The problem was that they did not have anyone to sit across from them and open the envelope with them. And that is where Vivienne comes in, not as a hero, not as someone who fixed their lives, but as someone who showed up and stayed. There is something about showing up consistently that I keep coming back to. Not the grand gesture, the Tuesday, the Thursday, the 40-minute walk in November boots, the second cup of tea at Margaret's kitchen table. This kind of persistence is not glamorous. It does not make a good story in the moment. It only becomes visible over time when you look back and realize that the person who changed things was the one who kept coming back. That is what I think people miss when they talk about resilience. They picture it as getting up after being knocked down, which is part of it, but the longer, quieter version of it is the willingness to rebuild without an audience. To do the next right thing when no one is watching and the outcome is not guaranteed. Vivienne did not know that Adele would ask her to take over the clinic. She did not go on that first Thursday because she was building towards something. She went because someone had written, "Come in" on a sign in blue pen, and she thought she could be useful. That instinct to look for where you can be useful instead of where you can be noticed is not luck. It is a kind of moral orientation that gets developed over time, through practice, through the quiet accumulation of choices about what matters and what does not. The last image in this story is not the bigger room or the second notebook or the clinic with more tables. It is a woman walking home in the November dark, 40 minutes, good boots, no audience, knowing where she is going. I think that is the whole lesson, if there is one, not the destination, the direction.